Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to those who are watching this live stream policing board meeting to receive and question the Chief Constable on his monthly report. Our board members, the Chief Constable and his team, are all joining us through Zoom, so we hope the technology is working, and advance apologies if any streaming drops for any reason. We've had problems earlier on in our private session of the board, which is why we come to you a bit later than initially anticipated, but I hope that you will be able to hear loud, clear and continue the debate today. It's our first meeting of 2021, and it's regrettable that I must start it by recording board condemnation of recent threats made against a number of political representatives, graffiti on premises and other acts of hate carried out in the community, including the fire at Belfast Multicultural Resource Centre. We had a cold-blooded murder in North Belfast on Tuesday and a number of security and other incidents of concern over the past few weeks, including the situation that has arisen at our ports. As a board, we urge anyone with information on any of these incidents to pass them to the police, and there will be questions around these for the Chief Constable a little later in our meeting. Chief Constable, you're aware of public discussions and media commentary on the policing response to a number of funerals in contravention of the health guidelines. We completely understand the frustration and anger within the community around this issue, and particularly from those who have lost loved ones and fully complied with the health guidelines and rules. People and political representatives calling for enforcement, but we recognise also the sensitivities around police intervention in the middle of a funeral. What is expected is fulsome explanation and communication on the policing decisions made, information on engagement with the families in advance and the follow-up taken in respect of those who do not comply, and why there is no apparent sanction in the form of post-funeral fines. Because at the minute the sense is that nothing is happening to those who break the rules, and if anything is happening in the form of investigations, it takes too long a time to get the file to the PPS. It may well be for the Chief Constable, Chief Constable, that you believe more executive direction is needed on funerals or further adjustment to regulations to provide police with power to give fines post-event on a basis of video evidence. But if that is the case, then this needs to be spelt out. So unsurprisingly, members will have questions on this and also issues around police power of entry. The board was advised today of a projected funding deficit of circa 23 million for the year 2021-22. Discussion is ongoing to explore opportunities to close this projected funding gap. However, the options available to the PSNI are limited, but we will return to this issue following committee discussion and scrutiny of the proposed draft resource plan. Since our last meeting, we have appointed Pamela McCready as your new Chief Operating Officer, and so I'm sure her experience will benefit the budgetary discussions that need to take place. On our call today, we have ACC Gray, and on behalf of the board, I want to congratulate her on her recently announced appointment to the Met in London. Very well warranted promotional move. And in the private session of the board, many of our members have been reflecting on past experiences over many years with ACC Gray, and indeed in previous roles, we believe from Sergeant up, but they weren't quite clear on that particular issue. But many congratulations, Barbara, and we wish you well on your future with the Met. So we have your report, Chief Constable, and we will have a discussion. We've had a lot of discussion in private already, but there are many more questions to be put, and so we'll go straight to those once we have heard your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Chair, and there is a lot to get through today. I'm just checking. Are you hearing me all right there?
Yes.
I think we're just having an issue with the... yes, thank you very much. Firstly, in a practical sense, just to echo your comments about welcoming Pamela onto the senior team. It's a really, really constructive appointment for us. She'll start in a few weeks, and we'll pick up Barbara's change of circumstances at the end, so it's not lost. I am conscious that it's 2 months since I've last appeared before you, and clearly, as you outlined in your introduction, there are a raft of almost simultaneous and competing policing issues that there is rightly interest, scrutiny, and some questions to be answered around. So I'll try and address that a bit more fulsomely than perhaps I do normally in the introduction, mindful, of course, some events are so fast moving that what we put in the report that was submitted last week and where we are now has changed. Clearly, we still operate in the context of the pandemic, and it's sobering to remember since the last time I was before you that over 800 people have lost their lives, and this probably adds to the sentiment of upset, anxiety and concern that plays out in so many different ways. So I do accept that the discussion around how we police a pandemic remains a very lively one, and recent events have brought the focus into funerals, and also how at times the response to that is politicised, but also exasperated by the scenes in East Belfast on Tuesday afternoon. So I'm conscious that both scrutiny and concern remains high. I accept that obviously the narrative around policing of funerals has become quite critical recently, and I think it's my job to listen to the voice, not just in this forum, but wider afield, and reflect on that. Mindful, I think, of the reasons to tread really carefully, and I'll come on to that in a minute. I think we would all agree if there was an easy answer to this in the unique circumstances of COVID, we would have found it. But I'm also conscious in our policing style of listening to people around me in terms of the lessons of the past. We have to accept there's a small minority of people that do feel that the rules don't apply to them. And that's just unconscionable when it comes to the dignity of being able to grieve and bury our dead. And this small number of people, I think, frankly, are treating the communities for which they come from with contempt because it's doing more harm than good. I'm sure it's not lost on the silent majority that do obey the rules that these egregious breaches risk spreading COVID even more. So whilst we all resile at the threat of the potential of violence, we have to be careful that some of the hidden assumptions don't blunt a police response, and I'll come on to that. I do welcome the debate about where we go, because there's been a lot of challenge put down, but what does good actually look like when we're trying to sort of address communities that are generally upset and sometimes by fear, but generally as well in terms of COVID, anxiety and other worries. So maybe in the course of the session today, we can explore that. The executive has to be said, and you touched upon that, Chair, has made fast law to help combat the virus and protect public health, and the basic rules are there. But we have been silent on getting operational guidance from the executive from the get-go on funerals. And the rules have changed numerous times, as you're probably aware, but I think in the middle of this, public frustration or expectations hasn't, and that's one of the dilemmas. It's worth remembering as well, and we'll come on to this, that we do operate in a broad regulatory framework, and that just helps us sort of put some practical constraints on what we can actually do, because the coronavirus regulations are in the jargon what called summary offences, which brings them down into, whilst the impact is serious, how we can treat them is different and more minor. So we're managing public health legislation and not criminal law. And the consequences of that does limit our tactical options when we have to balance what we do against the other principles of proportionality, justification and necessity. The fast law we're making sense of also has contradictions. So to give you one example, and you referenced that in your introduction, that 25 people can go to a funeral, but anyone can leave their house and attend a funeral, no matter how many people are there. So I think there's still more work to be done to tidy up some of these contradictions. And equally, when we move away from funerals, gatherings, protests, parties, and other issues we've had to deal with all trigger competing human rights. And we have been reminded, frankly, by yourselves as a board and the Ombudsman about we have to get the balance right when we apply policing tactics real time. So there's Article 8 to family life is engaged often, Article 9, freedom of religion, and of course Article 14 about no discrimination, for example, on grounds of religion, political or other grounds. So there's a big mix here. I think we'd all recognise that this is not just a matter of policing in Northern Ireland, and indeed the news of the last 2 weeks has shown how policing in Great Britain and indeed across Europe is struggling sometimes to balance regulatory compliance with a policing style that's upfront, fair, impartial, objective, consistent and acceptable to all. But I do accept it's my job as Chief Constable with the team that I lead to root what we do in a framework where we derive our legitimacy from, and also our lawful authority to use powers and responsibilities that you've invested in us to keep us safe. I just thought it's worth reminding, given some of the debate, about where we take our authority from when we make some of these decisions that are attracting criticism and controversy. The Police Act actually demands that we work with the consent and cooperation of communities, and our Code of Ethics sets out how use of force is effectively a last resort, not a forefront when we're planning different policing operations. The Human Rights Act does, as I've suggested, define different relationships between individuals and the state in terms of restrictions or otherwise. And they put sort of different dimensions in how we go about everyday life. And I think importantly, and it's worth stressing this, that across the UK, our response to policing of gatherings and public order is actually enshrined in something called the core principles of accredited professional practice, from which we actually derive the somewhat famous now 4Es approach. And I thought, given some of the debate, it's worth reminding members extracts from it. So police commanders need to set the style and tone at the start of an operation and beware of the potential impact on public perceptions. We must use engagement and dialogue whenever possible. We must demonstrate consideration and application of relevant human rights principles, and police powers should be used proportionately and appropriately. And planning should be based on information and intelligence. So taken together, this probably serves to remind us, while policing of issues, particularly such as funerals, is such a difficult and emotive issue, and where we have little lawful room for manoeuvre. I think it's fair to say that enforcement isn't the problem, how we do it is. So I recognise that many see some of the breaches that have been in the public space and on media as a kick in the teeth, but we are here to uphold the law, and let me be very clear about that. We can, have done and will do look at our approach with fresh eyes, conscious of the risk of groupthink. But our considered approach on issues like this has stood the test of time, which fundamentally are explain the rules and gather evidence to use later. In recent days, I've spoken with people from across communities, wider commentators, and indeed yesterday, our independent advisory group, as well as security partners, on a raft of issues that affect our choice of tactics and style. The message, I think, is probably repeating what maybe you would argue you already know, that one misstep and we face significant backlash. So even in the face of unequivocal breaches, we have to pass an evidential test in a criminal justice process that often takes too long. And we have to remember, I think, the Denzel Washington quote, "It's not what you know, it's what you can prove." And that is at the forefront of our response. In recent days, I've also met our Gold Commander who's on the call today for this operation, some of the district commanders and operational specialists, and I've also spoken to the Director of Public Prosecutions. I think we recognise that going forwards, consistency has to be a key part of our message, and we've heard that loud and clear. But consistency can't always mean the same thing, given the things like geography and community impact that affect discrete operations. I think we will want to see how we can bring together better real-time information about what we're doing. And we want to improve evidence gathering and at times perhaps be more audacious in how we do that. And we've been having dialogue in recent days, the Gold Commander Alan Todd is on the call tonight, with members of the Public Prosecution Service about how we can use fixed penalty notices post-event, which is not something we've been doing hitherto, to actually try and see if we can speed up the process. I think it's acceptable to say that time has been the enemy in investigating some of the breaches that we've seen across the country. We've actually put officers against 24 breaches of coronavirus regulations in relation to funerals, and there's 11 investigations going on as we speak. But we do have difficulties. We have to view film afterwards. We've got to identify people that actually aren't liable to arrest, and then at times secure their cooperation in attending for interview, which all takes time. I think you touched on earlier, Chair, about the budget. I think it's about recognising that the COVID issue is also rooted in our policing style. We've invested heavily in neighbourhood policing in the last 18 months, but at the very moment we want to sort of capitalise on that and cement it, that our budgetary foothold comes under real and present threat. We do face the prospect, however we cut this at the moment and our best efforts, of losing around 300 police officers in the next 12 months from our headcount. And I can go into a bit more detail later on in this session. We can see in the papers I've put before you about some of our ideas in broad terms to sort of manage the £23 million gap. And we do recognise that improving productivity and value for money will have to be at the forefront of our response, but it won't provide all of the answers. We will want to continue to invest in digital policing, and I'll come on to that later. But for example, a recent trial of ruggedised laptops for frontline officers has been showing that we're saving up to an hour a day out at the police station by pushing technology into officers' hands in the community rather than dragging them back to the police station. But there still remains the gap of 300 people. I suppose the debate and dilemma doesn't stop in the last few days, where we have to sort of try and explain what we're doing in relation to gatherings in public spaces, sports events, prison protests, anti-mask protests, white line protests, all of which consume time and investigative resources during and after the event, alongside even in the last 2 weeks, 2 major security alerts, and then as we saw, the quite awful scenes in East Belfast on Tuesday. The melting pot doesn't stop there. So we've got ACC Mark McEwen, who can't be on the call today, leading our response to the most immediate concern after issues around Article 16 were triggered on Friday. He's heavily involved in trying to bring a remedy with other partners to what we're seeing in Belfast and Larne ports. But frankly, this isn't just solely a policing problem. There are also a number of signal incidents and events that you've referred to, Chair, in terms of graffiti, bomb hoaxes, posters, and other forms of alert to rising community tension, just as police officers may fall in the months ahead. What I have done to assure you, and I'm sure we'll explore this further, is in recent days, I've taken steps with the senior team to change our operational tempo, but it does rely on a workforce that is working really hard round the clock to remedy a whole range of different issues. I've seen firsthand, and I'm sure you have, that their resolve is admirable. And despite the bit brats and sometimes armchair criticism, I think we have to pay tribute to their resilience in the face of a raft of different challenges, in the same way that we've recognised other public service and emergency workers in the COVID space. We will be accelerating the development of intelligence and changing our policing posture in parts of Belfast following recent events, and I can come on to that in the main session, Chair, under the banner of Operation Pivot, where we see tension has risen, and we need to do more to steer communities away from the threat of more violence in this very febrile atmosphere we seem to be at the moment. I think if there's one message beyond policing, I would implore people that are listening to today's sort of session, is that it's now time for wise words and calm heads. And we need to actually work together to look at a route map to normality, because that seems to be the opportunity before us to step back from the brink in terms of community tension. Finally, Chair, before I submit to questions, I wouldn't want to lose sight of the fact that in the midst of all this, ACC Gray, who you referenced, has had some fantastic news in terms of a personal achievement, being selected for promotion to a senior role in the Metropolitan Police in London. I echo your comments. We will miss her, but send our best wishes for the next stage of her career. So she'll be sorely missed, but we're really pleased she's made such a significant leap up the ranks. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that comprehensive run through, Chief Constable. We have many questions, as we've said, and we will get straight into those. And I'm going to ask Dolores Kelly if she will start us off, please. Dolores.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Chief Constable, for your report, some of which we have covered earlier in the private session. But in relation to the policing of funerals, I mean, I do agree that past scenes of policing of funerals has never done any good. And I know from my own experience in my own constituency and the policing of, for example, distant Republican commemorations, where the gathering of evidence and the prosecution of offenders then followed up actually did work and did help public confidence. So, but I do think your comments around the executive and the consistency, could tease that out a wee bit more. I mean, what would you like to see? I think it was a bit late that the police were asked to come to those enforcement subgroups in terms of the executive, and how you would see things to be made a bit more clear and easier to police. And I know, Chair, that I'm not too sure if we get another opportunity to speak, given that there's a lot on, but I had hoped to have had an update today from the Chief Constable on both the Dunmurry and Muckamore investigations, which are also a matter of huge concern around safeguarding the vulnerable, because today we see further reports about the number of children having been placed in care or concerns around lockdown and the safeguarding of children. So I just wonder, Chief, if you might take the opportunity to feedback on where those investigations are.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dolores. Just very quickly, in relation to Muckamore, we've made 15 arrests in total now, and there are 2 files with the PPS. I think they're saying it's the biggest file they've ever received from us. So that investigation continues. Clearly, COVID is affecting that. I think Barbara can come in a minute around Dunmurry. In relation to the regulations, I think it said in the introduction, Dolores, that we recognise we've all had to wrestle, both here and other parts of the UK, with the executive having to make fast law. We've been asking from really the outset for operational guidance to help shape our tactics alongside the guidance that supports the regulations in the public domain. I think Alan and I were talking today. I think the information, for example, to undertakers runs to 42 pages of guidance. So I think wherever we can to simplify things, but also to help us make sense of all the competing different parts of law that affect our operational practice will be useful. But perhaps if I bring Alan in just to update all the members over and above Dolores's question, just as some of the work we're doing at the moment to try and have a decent working relationship with the Department of Health and the lawmakers to see where we get this right. So I think Alan's on the call somewhere, Chair.
Yeah, Alan.
Thanks, Chief. Thank you, Chair. Yes, Dolores, I mean, clearly, neither the Chief nor myself or anybody else in the police service welcomes the pictures of people who turn out to breach the health protection regulations. None of us particularly comfortable with that. And what can be perceived, I don't agree that it is, but what can be perceived at the time as police not taking direct action isn't always well received, although I think that sort of hides the truth, and I would accept that we have some maybe messaging to do around that. I did try to capture some of the complexity of this in the COVID policing report to the board in November of last year, and the various things we have to weigh and measure and balance, which the Chief touched on earlier. There are a range of challenges, but at its heart, the regulations have been changing at pace. That's not anybody's fault. That's what happens in a pandemic when you're trying to fight a quick-moving virus. And getting regulations in itself out, it's half the battle. Then having guidance issued by the issuing departments to inform how they should be policed and to improve the quality of that law is also important. And we continue to work with our partners on that. But there are practical difficulties on the ground, which I've again tried to capture in the November report. It's the very practicalities, and we're dealing with another set of circumstances today, where you have a funeral turnout where you're seeking to identify people not immediately recognisable to police, most of whom are wearing masks because of the pandemic, most of whom are carrying umbrellas because it's a wet day, and intruding into that space as police officers into a family and their friends' grief and trying to police that is a very difficult balancing act. I've just been listening to those transmissions with the officers on the ground this morning, and there are no, if there were simple and straightforward and easily achievable solutions, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I think we all understand that they're not, and we continue to try and learn our lessons as we go and balance those. But again, I think given this is a public meeting, I would just issue an appeal to people, please find other ways to show your respect, to show your concern for families and their grief. But turning out at families, particularly those where the person being buried themselves has been a victim of COVID, and raising everybody else's risks in that regard is counterintuitive, counterproductive, and unhelpful to communities and around and policing in general. And I would ask people to consider that, please, going forward.
Alan, could I just say, I mean, I've spoken to some nurses, particularly those who work in intensive care, and what they have been telling me around the latest surge of the most serious infections of COVID is that a number of the people had either attended funerals, wakes, or house parties over Christmas and New Year. I just wondered, have you any feedback from your health colleagues in relation to those anecdotal statistics?
through the local planning groups, which are co-chaired by ourselves and Solace, the local government agency, we get a weekly feedback of where clusters are and what the likely causes are. The significant priorities for policing coming out of those identified from the health data are house parties in general, and it's not any rocket science around that. Anywhere where you get people in close proximity to each other, not wearing face coverings, particularly with there's alcohol involved, and indoors in particular. So that starts in the house party space. It has the potential to move into the space of wakes, and we understand that the cultural sensitivities around that. But those are the high risk. Those are the high risk areas. That's what's been identified by health, and that's why that's our priority for policing.
Okay, thank you. Mervyn Storey. Mervyn up next, please.
Sorry, I thought Barbara was coming in about Dunmurry.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. To further come back to Dolores's question.
Yes, thank you. And I suppose just replying on behalf of Public Protection Branch. So 18 of the 32 cases being investigated have now been closed, and that has been following, the receipt of expert advice as well, and the families are all aware of that situation. In relation to the other investigations that are ongoing, matters still remain under review and under live investigation. So I suppose in brief, that's the update as to where the Dunmurry investigation sits now.
Chair, I think we'll come back to that at a later stage offline.
Okay. Thank you. Mervyn. And Tom, yeah, Mervyn.
Thank you, Chair. And can I concur with the comments in relation to wishing Barbara well? And we trust that she has every success and she will be sorely missed in the delivering of policing in Northern Ireland. I will not tread over my colleague Trevor Clarke's concerns, and he'll raise about funerals. But all I will say is this: the tone was set by the Deputy First Minister and other public representatives when they breached the regulations many, many months ago. That's where the fault line comes. So no wonder other people are following that disgraceful example that was set. But Chief Constable, obviously there's another concern which is emanating in terms of the protocol and the implications and the difficulties in having the imposition of this protocol against the will of the people of Northern Ireland, which is affecting their everyday lives. I'm glad that today we see the public reaction being funneled into an e-petition, which within 2 hours of opening has now over 12,000 signatures. That's the proper way to funnel people's opposition. However, we have seen in recent times the attacks on politicians, property and so on, and graffiti, and a threat to the staff at ports. Can you, Chief Constable, give any indication as to whether or not this level of societal disruption will continue, and what steps the police are going to take to address that?
Thanks, Mervyn. And I think in relation to the protocol, obviously the best solution out of this is frankly a political one. We know there's a lot of work going on at the moment. In relation to the specifics, there's been 26 graffiti daubings across the country on basis of today's information, and clearly they've affected buildings in the public space and sometimes political offices, and the separate things we've been doing in relation to that. I think the trigger point for your question, Mervyn, was obviously after the issue around vaccine and protocol on Friday, this quickly accelerated. There was some single strand intelligence, uncorroborated intelligence, that fed into a briefing from the local police commander in Larne with partners at the start of the week. And that has accelerated into people taking steps to look at how they preserve the safety of their workforce. But I think the first thing is stressing is that there is no credible intelligence to substantiate this one single item of intelligence. What we have been doing, though, we have one of our senior officers, Assistant Chief Constable Mark McEwen. He's been in Police Speak, the Gold Commander for EU Exit from months back, but he's been heavily involved in recent days, working with the two councils, with DERA, with other government departments and indeed with the UK government to try and get a resolution to the most immediate issues, but also recognising there does feel to be a febrile atmosphere at the moment. He has stood up our Gold Operating Centre to make sure that at his disposal there are sufficient resources to respond to whatever happens next in that sense. So, for example, last night we had intelligence about more graffiti, so we changed our patrolling stance to prevent that, and it would seem, as we stood here this morning, we've achieved that. But we are keeping a really careful eye on community sentiment, on social media, where some of this plays out, as well as some of the practicalities we most immediately see at the port. We will be running that for the foreseeable future until we're confident that working with other partners in the government, that things feel a little calmer than they do at the moment, Mervyn.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gerry Kelly.
Thank you, Chair.
No.
Thank you, Chief Constable. I want to talk about I'm sure you've seen all the social media, and we're talking about social media earlier on around Pitt Place in East Belfast, which went around like wildfire. And I mean, I'm sure many others, and it was talked about in the board earlier, many others got the videos sent to them. And the videos of something like 40 men masked who are supposed to be attached to in some way East Belfast UVF, and certainly the word is that they were in to intimidate individuals and ended up closing or forcing the closure of a community centre there. And it looks from the video that there was not an appropriate response, and I was wondering, did you want to say anything about that? I noticed that there was only a small number of police officers there.
Yeah, thanks, Gerry. It clearly is one of the policing issues this week, and we can't deny that. I think when I became aware of the social media myself, we convened a meeting of the senior team yesterday, and I asked for a fast time review of what happened. I caveated that review, frankly, by sort of experience of the past, that without trying to sound patronising to anybody, that what you see on a short burst of film is sometimes not the whole story. I have to accept that the imagery hasn't done us any favours, but I think there's a different tone I can put on this, in that this was a fast time and spontaneous response to what has been shown in part on social media. It happened that just after Hoppus 1 on the Tuesday, we did get some, again, single source information that related to a specific person in that community, and our priority was to find that person. We sent 2 neighbourhood officers, but things change actually quite quickly, and the whole incident you see in terms of what played out in part on social media, I think as best I can work it out, lasted 17 minutes from start to finish. We had a crowd at the Ballymac Community Centre at just before 10 to 3. Within 3 minutes, it had grown to 50 people. And we actually had officers, a small number of officers had found the people that we were worried about in the centre, and they were trying to assess what had gone on with those people and put themselves between them and the crowd. There were just a small number of police officers present at that point, whilst we were calling for other police officers to come from specialist units, such as the dog team, as well as other operational people, such as the tactical support group. They were arriving, and frankly, as they did, the crowd started to disperse. In credit, we had an inspector on scene within 9 minutes. He took charge of what he saw in front of him and started to prepare an operational plan to deal with what was actually in front of officers. But the time he arrived, we seemed to have 6 officers to actually deal with 50 plus people. We quickly started to assemble officers, and as we did, the crowd dispersed. So within 6 minutes, they'd gone. Now, I know there'll be questions about what they were doing and why. We were able to gather evidence at the time, and we are now following up in terms of fast time investigation in relation not to just COVID breaches, but to other criminal offences. And that's something that the district commander is pursuing today. I do recognise it's a matter of concern. So we convened meetings yesterday where from yesterday evening, we upped our operational and visible presence in East Belfast, and we've made resources available to the police commander, Mark McEwen, to deploy into East Belfast at his discretion, while we sort of send out a very clear message: we are here to uphold the law and protect that part of the community from intimidation by paramilitary thugs, frankly. We recognise that there's more to do to reassure people in terms of what happened. I think there's been a lot of work gone on in the last 24 hours to do that. And as we make progress with the investigation, we will either announce that through the media or indeed update the board at either committees or a future meeting.
If I could just come in briefly, Chief Constable, thank you for that. I mean, I'm repeating, because I don't represent East Belfast, but political representatives of East Belfast. And their point is that the problem with the East Belfast UVF is pre-COVID. It has been there over a long period of time. This intimidation has gone on. People have been put out of their houses before. And yet there is a dearth of arrests and prosecutions over a long period of time. So I want to put that to you in terms of, obviously, this was, and we talked earlier, and other members talked earlier about COVID, and rightly so. But this is an intimidation process. This is a group of somewhere around 40 masked men who were seen to walk in and then move past the police again. I think that's what the visual aspect, certainly, of it, and I know you give some explanation of what that might be, but the difficulty is it's not just one incident. This is an ongoing process, which is certainly happening in East Belfast and indeed in some other constituencies as well.
Thank you. I think, you know, the visuals are difficult. We're just trying to put some context on it. And again, absolutely, this is a long-term problem. That's why we have a paramilitary crime task force, where we have our own officers working with the National Crime Agency and other people to target paramilitary activity, not just in East Belfast, Gerry, as you know, but in other places. I can assure you that we are using our best efforts to target people that are trying to disrupt the safety and the security of communities. There is just no place for this sort of thuggery, or indeed organised crime, because that's really what this is about underneath. There are other factors, I think, play on this, such as how some community groups are funded and then exploited. We have to acknowledge, frankly, that it's outside of our control, but the criminal justice system it does take forever here, so that the difference between an arrest and a sanction is perhaps longer than it should be. Certainly from yesterday, I know we're redoubling efforts in the short term to see what intelligence we can develop and exploit to try and reassure communities we're on the front foot in a policing style. But we also have to look at more longer term responses to this problem, because we've been trying to wrestle with this, as you know, for years. And a bit like the funerals question, if there was an easy answer, we'd probably found it. But one of the things we're working on at the moment, when people ask questions sometimes, where have you looked? We're looking to see, for example, in Merseyside, they've been highlighted consistently as good practice in terms of responses to organised crime. And Barbara, who's on the call, is looking at seeing, can we adapt that response to blend better proactive and reactive investigation, intelligence development, and a uniform presence in vulnerable communities to put these people on the back foot. But is there anything else you want to say, Barbara, or do you think I've covered it, or do you want to give a bit more detail and facts and figures?
Yeah, I think I'd just, well, if you don't mind, take the opportunity, certainly as regards the work of the Paramilitary Crime Task Force against the key groups that we're addressing: East Belfast UVF, West Belfast UDA, South East Antrim UDA, and the INLA, North West and Belfast. I mean, in the last 6 months, there has been a total of 37 arrests. We've had 43 people charged, or 43 charges and reports, 99 searches, 53 drug seizures, number of vehicle seizures and weapon seizures as well. As regards East Belfast UVF, in that period of time, against quite a lot of investigative activity, in total, around £43,000 worth of drugs have been seized. That's taking drugs which were undoubtedly meant for drug dealing, causing harm to people within the local community through different operations and searches. Again, £14,000 of cash taken out of the hands of criminals there, and investigations continue around our drugs and money laundering, and those investigations will continue at pace. I can give you assurances around that. And I think I'm keen also just to, I suppose, remind members to a certain extent that there have been charges in the anniversary of the Inogle murder, where it was just in the last number of days, and indeed people have been charged with that murder, which has had horrific impact on families and right across that community. So it's just to give some context and hopefully reassurance around the proactivity that we're absolutely committed to.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Barbara. Can I take the next question from Janet? Janet Gray, please.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, just trying to get unmuted. Thank you, Chief Constable, for the report. And could I just start by saying many congratulations and every success to Barbara on the new role. Simon, I know you have an awful lot going on at the moment, but I just wanted to ask what progress has been made in tackling the increase on the antisocial behaviour in Belfast City Centre. There are an awful lot of youths, very intimidating youths, roaming the streets, and there's reports of open drug dealing and various things going on. I've spoken with various key workers actually in the city, and they all say the same thing. They're too frightened now to walk around the town on their break, etc. And likewise, I feel the same way. I normally would travel through the city a couple of times a week with my white cane, and I just now feel too vulnerable. I know these people have always been there, but it's just now with lockdown, things are just so deserted. The streets are deserted, and so they're much more visible. So I wondered, had you any progress on that? Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. I'm sorry, obviously, on a personal level, that's how it's changed your own sort of patterns of life. That's you know, that is a real shame. I think in relation to antisocial behaviour, firstly, it's in the report where actually across about half of the districts of Northern Ireland at the moment, it's up more than normal, but it actually repeats the trend that we're seeing right across the UK. Alan, I know in general sense, had meeting with the district commander after our performance meeting last month to see how we're bringing sort of good practice to bear in terms of problem solving, working with other partners. You referenced some stuff for yourself there, Janet, but I know only very recently Alan has been sort of looking down into this in the city centre. So I'll probably bring him in, if you don't mind, just to give you some reassurance about what we are doing. And if we can speak offline about making you feel a little safer, we're happy to do that.
Thank you.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Alan.
So I think you've captured the circumstances as we understand them really well, actually. I think we have a number of factors, as always, at play. There are a number of people in Belfast City Centre who frequent Belfast City Centre who have particular needs in terms of housing, in terms of health provision, in terms of social support. One of the unfortunate impacts of COVID is that some of that support, given the other stresses and strains on health and social care, aren't immediately available, and therefore partnership working, as in all these things, comes under stress and strain. I also think, and you, I think, absolutely got an assessment right in my mind. I think those people are there on an ongoing basis, but I think when footfall falls sharply in Belfast City Centre, then perhaps their presence is more obvious, and people just innately feel safer when there are more people around. And without the footfall in city centres and on transport, people don't get that same sense of security from having other people in the vicinity. And that's not unique to Belfast or any other town in Northern Ireland or anywhere across Europe are all suffering similar issues. What I would say in terms of reassurance, Janet, is that, you know, I have a regular meeting generally every 2 or 3 weeks as a gold commander for COVID with a whole range of business representatives. And Belfast City Centre businesses are really strongly represented through that group. And they, through my meeting and indeed their day-to-day workings with the local Belfast commander do address these issues. They have, by and large, not underestimating some of the challenges, but they take great reassurance from the fact that we have maintained the numbers and the shifts of the Belfast City Centre neighbourhood team, who work with people across the city centre and business owners across the city centre to address these issues on a daily basis and to respond to those issues as they're raised by those groups and their representatives, and will continue to do so. And that works on a daily basis through the local commander, and then I get the feedback on that and any specifics in the follow-up. So that'll continue, and I accept I think there's a bit of perception versus reality gap, but I absolutely understand the perception, and we're working to manage that. Janet.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Chief.
Thank you, Mike Nesbitt. Sorry, Mike, I got you just as you turned to speak to someone there, so apologies. But if you want to put your question next, please.
Yeah, I've two areas, Chief Constable. One's funerals, but also Pitt Park. And what I would like you to address is, can you imagine looking out your window on a Tuesday afternoon and seeing 40 or 50 masked men from a named criminal gang walking past your house with police officers observing? What would you think of the police at that point?
Thanks, Mike. I mean, I certainly I try and put myself in that position, because I don't try and pretend that the images, as you've seen in the public domain, really look quite atrocious when you've got a whole group of thugs singing alongside the police. My brief is, Mike, that having gone through this with the senior officers that picked up the pieces, that we had intervened and we were sort of herding that crowd away from where there was immediate threat to a small number of people in the community centre. As I said in an early response to Gerry's question, the inspector that was there was mobilising more police resource to come, with the intention of dealing with that group of people there and then. But frankly, before we got officers there, they had dispersed, and we're now following that up in terms of inquiry and investigation. So I don't doubt, if I was, you could put an elderly person, a young mum looking out the window, it'd be, what earth is going on? But it's suffice to say that, commensurate with what we understood and the outcome, we prevented any serious violence in the moment, and we're now following that up. But I do recognise that the optics aren't good. I've been speaking to the district commander about what we need to do, not just in policing, but bringing other agencies in, or indeed keeping them there. And if needs be, if it's about pushing forward, even in COVID, to see how we formulate a different dialogue with the community, more than happy to do with that. In normal circumstances, you'd be calling a community meeting, but in the short term, that would put more people in danger of COVID transmission. So it limits some of our opportunity for dialogue, but we are conscious of the effect short term, which is why through the Gold Commander, we've stepped up resources, and we'll continue to do that, reviewing it every 7 days until we can reassure ourselves and the community that we have got a grip on this, and that this is by no means acceptable. We are here to enforce the law, and we will where there's evidence.
I appreciate that, Chief Constable. My concern is public confidence, obviously, and the same would go with the 24 funerals that you've been looking at for breaches. And my question on that is, you have a policy of the 4 E's: and engage, explain, encourage, and only at the end of that would you try to enforce. But there's a public perception that your officers maybe know in advance exactly what's going to happen during the course of a funeral. So my question is, when you engage and you explain, what do you actually say, and what's the tone you use in your approach?
Well, Alan can come on this if he wants to, Mike, but broadly, it's quite clear that when we get notice of a funeral that might attract different attention, let's remember, we talked about the figures that even since I was last before you, that over 800 people have died. The vast majority of people have respected the regulations, and in difficult circumstances have abided by the guidance as well to bury loved ones in very difficult and distressing circumstances. So that the dilemma is making a small number of people think that they're no different to anybody else and abide by the rules. And I know from when we've gone through this line by line, even in recent days, that we make it plain that the restrictions are there to be observed, in this case at 25 people, and that if they're breached, we will be gathering evidence and following it up. So we're not here to negotiate. we're not here to set bounds, but we are here to remind people of their responsibilities, which also implies to not just, sadly, the people that have lost loved ones, but the people that are coming to the funeral. Alan has given a lot of detail about wider health risks and what happens before and afterwards as well. But we recognise this is a matter of concern. We have 11 sets of investigations still running. There's 28 files into the PPS as we speak at the moment, and we are making progress on one of the other investigations. But the tone underneath sometimes, as said in my introduction, like, our hands are tied by the summary nature of these offences. We can't compel people to come to interview. We can't arrest them. So we have to follow up slow time, which I know is causing frustration. That's why we are looking at the moment actively, can we issue fixed penalty notices in the days afterwards where we know who people are. But I'll just bring Alan in to see if he wants to say anything else to give you some depth about what we're doing.
Hey, thanks, and thanks, Mike. I mean, I would invite people to read the COVID report from November, because it does capture some of the complexities. I think a lot of us wish it was easier to get some of the outcomes we might need. To answer your direct question, Mike, the engagement piece is really a statement of make sure people are aware of the regulations, the constraints, and what our expectations of them are. It's not a negotiation process. We're really there to tell people what the requirements are and what we would seek from them, and trying to maintain those funerals within the regulations. It often happens at very short notice, because quite often now funerals aren't notified in the press, and there are lots of funerals, and we have to work our way through all that, and it's not the only thing we have to do. So we do engage in that basis. But it's been well practiced around the various competing needs and competing rights and responsibilities within the regulations, where and I tried to cover this in the report about the difficulties in identifying people not immediately known to police without getting up close and personal to corteges with grieving families and relatives, and the contrast and the difficulties around that. And a day like today, when people are wearing face coverings for public safety reasons, carrying umbrellas because it's a miserable day, and how close people police have to get into that space in an attempt to identify people, it's just operationally challenging within the sensitivity of funerals. But we do look at doing our best to identify those who are breaking the law. We do our best to progress that. And we continue to learn the lessons as we go through this to try and be better at it. But I can't promise people that it's easy or easily solved.
One brief follow-up of my chair to Alan. If the issue is covered by guidance rather than regulations, does that mean your hands are totally tied?
I'm not claiming our hands are tied by guidance in terms of funerals, Mike, but it's absolutely clear for us as senior police officers and the people who work for us that we're there to enforce the law and try to promote adherence to the law. Guidance is just guidance, and police have no role in that space. It informs our approach, but it's not part of the regulatory framework in which we work.
It's very clear. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I think, Trevor, from what Mervyn said earlier, your question is in regard to this area as well. So I'll bring you in here now if that's appropriate.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I suppose following actually on from what Alan's just said, let's be clear, is he saying then that the funeral stuff is guidance? And if it's guidance, why are you even investigating it in the first place? Can we just tie that one down first?
No, happy to take it. What I tried to say to Mike, Trevor, apologies if I didn't get my message clear around it. The piece about 25 at funerals is in the regulations. That's the piece that we follow up on. There are lots of other things around funerals, particularly around the roles of undertakers, families, responsibilities, which are in guidance and aren't immediately a space for policing. If that clarifies it.
Okay, well, and thanks for that, because I suppose going back to what the Chief has said earlier, and I took the warning from him in terms of his introduction about our language. But equally, I fire that straight. It's a case of do as we say, not as we do, because maybe lessons should be learned from the police as well, because I see whenever their statements go out, they said they negotiate it with the families. And we raise concerns about you actually negotiating, because it should be informing the families of the regulations. But I think we have to be clear. And to me, I'm unequivocal what type of funeral this is, whether it's a loyalist paramilitary or a Republican paramilitary. They are in breach of the guidelines, and it leaves out a very bad signal to the rest of us who are trying to adhere to those. So So for me, I think we need to be clear. Also, and I mean, I don't want to harp back, but I suppose the most high-profile funeral was the Storey funeral. And 5 months after that funeral, the Deputy First Minister said she still hadn't been spoken to. And I think that, again, is a signal, it's language that people pick up on, the people who, again, are trying to abide by the law. So whilst I take on board what Simon has said about the use of our language, the same should be said in terms of PSNI and their actions, because I think actions is as good as language, and they're actually very clear, interpreted by others, by what you do. And I think it's that piece where the confusion comes for many of the members of the public, where they see the Deputy First Minister, for example, going on public record 5 months after to say she hadn't been spoken to, whereas on the same week of the funeral last week, or one of the funerals last week, we read in the newspapers that the police attended Tesco's in Ballymena because there was a breach of COVID. So it's a case of, and I mean, this perception has been here for many years, that crime pays, terrorism pays, but law-abiding citizens don't. So I think there is a piece of work the police have to do in relation to that. That's my first point, if Simon wants to come back on that one first.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. There's quite a bit there, but I mean, I think sort of unpicking some of this, I think one of the issues is sometimes comparing apples and pears. So how we police a funeral and how we attend a supermarket or a house party, there are actually different bits of the regulations as well as different circumstances. I do sort of agree with you, actually, that Alan said in his last answer, frankly, we are here to sort of keep pressing forward, reviewing and learning from what we're doing. And I think we accept that for whatever best intentions, when we're putting language in either social media or press releases, that we've sought assurances, it actually is meant to convey that people should be obeying the rules. But what's being heard is that we're sort of negotiating with people and almost facilitating a breach. And that's not what we're about. And I agree, it's quite simple here that once you go above 25, you're breaching the regulations. So it's an emotive issue, but certainly even in recent days, we've had conversations about, if you like, how we streamline and pare back the language and we just say what we mean. So you should be seeing that going forwards. In relation to the funeral investigation, I don't really want to comment too much on that, Trevor, because the file is now with the PPS. And I know they're reviewing it to make the decision. And I'm sure the Deputy First Minister is able to sort of speak for herself in that respect. I think the broader thing here is also to reassure people that through Alan's best endeavours, and he's been working so hard with officers, frankly, around the clock in all sorts of different circumstances. We have used the regulations over 9,000 times now to enforce. Now, in one sense, you could argue that when we're trying to sort of recognise that people are dealing with all sorts of different difficulties, that the 3 E's is the best place to start, that in some places we have been quite unequivocal that enough is enough. So you won't see negotiation around house parties when you've got large numbers of people there. We will just enforce the law. And I know that's an approach that Alan's been taking. And I think it's reflected in the report where in a recent weekend, probably linked to a fight, we enforced the law over 250 times. That was a peak weekend for us, frankly.
I think so. I suppose actually something else actually Alan did say is, and I mean, and that may be the case, that the regulations are changing at pace. But once the funeral regulations had come in, they haven't changed at pace. And I think there's a consistency in the message of the police. I do accept, Simon, your comments around your language, because I have noticed in one of the recent funerals, the commentary around that has changed. And you know that we did raise this with you privately when the DUP met you last week. So, but I want to put that in public record that I acknowledge the fact that the language has changed. But I'm picking up on you're cautioning us today about our language, and I just want to remind the PSNI of responsibility in that as well. If the chair allows me maybe to go on then in terms of, and I'm going off this point slightly, but back to NDNA, the 7,500. And I suppose I'm asking you a direct question, because you've said today in relation to there's a possible reduction of 300 officers. We know we're probably sitting about 6,900, I think it is. That takes us, if those 300 officers go, that takes us down to 900 less than the commitment from NDNA. So I'm asking you a straight question today. Have you made a bid to the Justice Minister in relation to that commitment to getting your strength up to 7,500?
We have a business case with the Department of Justice that outlines our reasons for 7,500. So that's been a consistent pitch, frankly, Trevor, since even before New Deal, new approach was seen as a commitment. We've got our own reasons for assessing that. That's the operational sort of size that we think we need to deal with a whole range of issues. And we haven't come back from that. Obviously, whilst we have to live in the real world about pressure on public funds, you've seen today the whole range of issues that we're dealing with at the moment. And it is a stark concept or stark prospect that we are likely to lose at least 300 offices in the next 12 months unless we can remedy what's ahead of us. I'm not here to shroud wave. I'm just here to be candid with the board that the budget doesn't balance and there's only one real way of closing it, which is less people. And that's the work we're doing at the moment. But I think it's recognising that we're not the end game. We'll continue to lobby and to advocate behind the scenes. Mark's on the call doing just that at the moment with colleagues from the Department of Justice to make the case. We've written to the Justice Committee today to spell out what we see as the jeopardy. And obviously there's some details in the report, Trevor, but I didn't think trying to hide behind sort of weasel words is helping anybody either. And that's our best assessment at the moment about what the impact consciously is going to be if it's not remedied.
To be fair to you, Simon, I mean, I found you upfront with that, and I mean, I suppose if we look at today's picture, and I mean, you were upfront before the Brexit actually happened about what your plan may be required. So, but we've now got the Brexit. We've got the paramilitary activity on all sides that seems to be getting uneasy. We have the funeral piece around the COVID. We have the general COVID stuff. So I see the pressures, but for me, I'm at pains to understand that there's been a commitment, a political commitment by all parties who signed up, who took their seats in the executive, to honour a commitment of 7,500 officers, why that actually hasn't happened. So I hope that the Minister takes cognizance of that, and we will support you to continue to push to get that number.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor.
Yeah, and we all have a role to play, Trevor, in advocating for that, because we've all signed up, as you quite rightly say, to the 7,500, and we need to put the pressure on to deliver the funds that are required for that. Can I turn next to Edgar Jardine? Edgar, your question, please.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Again, to join with others in congratulating Barbara on her appointment and wishing her well. And also to say thank you to the Chief Constable and to Alan, particularly for their explanation of the many complex and conflicting issues that you have to deal with in relation to funerals and the kind of balancing of the tactical options. I think that was very, very useful. I really want to move on from where Trevor was, and that's around your compliment. Looking at the HR dashboard, it recorded some 600 officers who were on permanent restricted duties or duty adjustments, and representing about 9% of your complement. If you add to that a further 700, 800 who are unavailable for COVID at any point in time, we're talking about 1 in 5 of your complement, 20%. And the question is really the Chief Constable to comment on the implications of the resources available to him now, never mind the budget going forward, for operational deployment.
There's a few issues there, Edgar. Obviously, the first thing is that we have to have sufficient people to police round the clock, and we're able to do that. And I said in my introduction, and I think it's appropriate to do it again, to pay tribute to people's determination, flexibility and commitment in doing that, because I think I'm really proud about how people have kept going in the unique circumstances of COVID alongside, you know, I've lost count of how many different policing issues we've actually touched on directly or indirectly today. So it is a remarkable tribute to their determination and the leadership of officers and staff to keep going. Obviously, the COVID issue is unique. So some of the short to medium term effects on the workforce, I think we've got to try and separate. I think since the start of COVID, we've had 560 officers that have fallen sick with illness, and nearly 8,000 that have had to isolate at one point or another. So you can see longitudinally the effect. And obviously, Alan also has his contact trace centre here that is really good at giving good advice to keep people as safe as they can. And you'll see in the report, as the understanding of the virus has taken shape and we learn from it, we've actually changed how we operate. So in the workplace now, we're wearing masks at work as well as out in cars and things like that to reduce the spread. I think underneath this, the duty adjustment question has been an enduring and frankly almost a thorny issue for years and years here. We're not obviously the only police service affected by colleagues that over the course of their operational service with us are beset with various forms of injury and restriction that stop them doing a full-time role. The main one we are affected by actually is our requirement that everybody should be able to be deployed in full PPE to deal with disorder, perhaps because of some other history. The figures are something that are regularly reviewed. We haven't got our HR lead Yvonne on the call today. I know you or some of you will see her input in various committees. But I think in trying to wrestle with this, we're engaged with the Federation about seeing how we get fast time, for example, physiotherapy or other forms of support to officers. But some of the issues we are dealing with as a police service here are long-term and they're reflective of our unique circumstances. So as you know, we're the only service that carries firearms routinely every day, and there's a weight literally to that firearm on your hip. We wear heavy duty body armor. We've improved the design recently, but over years and years, certainly in the early days of adopting that policing style, it was heavy and cumbersome. And we also are moving in and out around the clock of armoured vehicles. And I know that you don't need to speak to many people in the organisation about the tales of woe around the armoured insignia and how really they weren't fit for purpose. In effect, many of the restrictions that we're wrestling with are the consequence of wearing heavy kit in small vehicles for too long. And that has a musculoskeletal effects that sometimes we can support people from. It's also about recognising that it's not the sort of stigmatising every officer that's got a restriction can't do meaningful work. We have a large number of people filling roles that aren't on the front line per se, or for example, doing investigative work, which is crucially important. But what we have been doing to try and help remedy this, even in sort of recent times, is improve the operational kit that officers are asked to wear. We've been modernising the fleet to make it more ergonomic and fit for purpose. And we've been investing heavily in the occupational health and welfare service that just doesn't address with physical illness, but also mental health problems, which we are an outlier on here, frankly, in terms of the long-term effects of PTSD and things on the workforce. So there's a whole melting pot of issues we have to wrestle with, which do affect the total resilience of the workforce. But we are determined to give appropriate support to colleagues when they either need physiotherapy or treatment to get them back to work, or more longer-term problems. But I know the point you're making about totality of the workforce, and clearly if we lose another 300 officers, it will only exacerbate that pressure.
Just a supplementary, and that is there any discernible trend in terms of the number who are on permanent duty adjustments, and do we benchmark with other forces?
We do benchmark with forces. For example, recently people like, well, where Barbara's going, the Met, Thames Valley, Hampshire, to try and see where there's practice. But in many ways, the environment is different because they're not routinely wearing heavy body armour, carrying a firearm in the way that we all are here. And similarly, some of the presumptions about what we ask officers to do are different because of our PPE situation as well in terms of personal protective equipment. So we look for good practice, not just within policing, but broader afield, because we want to provide the best support we can to officers that are either ill or affected by various forms of restrictions so we can get them back to full fitness. So this is a constant issue for us and we're here to learn lessons.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got 4 more questions that I've been notified of. Next one, please, from John Blair.
Chair, thank you. And can I start by adding to the good wishes expressed earlier to Barbara for her new role, and to wish her all the very best in that, and also to pick up on an issue discussed there just a moment ago, and the Chief referred to it earlier. I'd like to thank also officers in the wider policing team for the work they're doing in the COVID, in the context of COVID, and we've been reminded of the fact that they're at risk of COVID as well. And on top of that, their work they're doing on emerging issues, such as the issues around ports, paramilitary displays, and attacks on the premises of elected representatives, which of course we all condemn. To go back to the reference the Chief made in his report about policing with the consent and cooperation of communities, I want to pick up on the fact that hate crime figures for the most recent reporting period show an increase of 20% on incidents reported and 17% on crimes. In particular, want to reference the rise in racist hate crimes of around 11% and ask what action's been taken in this regard already, or what action's been planned to be taken.
Thank you, John. Well, obviously, there's details both in the national statistics and also in this month's report. There's a table there that even for people that are sort of watching, that spells out some of the changes. And actually, over the Christmas period, there was a shift not only in racist crime but also disability-related crime, which was clearly a worry. What we have been doing is hopefully not sitting complacent here. We touch on this actually in another part of the report about we have refreshed and modernised our approach to managing police performance. There's an issue at the end of the report about our new system called Pulse. So between the deputy, who can't be here today, the senior officers and myself, we review operational performance each month, and an area of focus in recent months has actually been hate crime. We have a senior officer, Emma Bond, who's our strategic lead for the response across Northern Ireland, and we've actually got her working at the moment to see across the range of things, be it prevention, reassurance, follow-up, timely investigation, and actually getting people brought to charge or summons. Are we doing all we can to protect victims from a whole range of communities? It also links, of course, to the commitment we've made around the Community Relations Task Force, John, because the more we can grow confidence in communities right across the country, the more we can have better insight of where there are incidents or crimes, and we can adjust the policing style to support those people and to root this sort of scourge out as best we can. So be reassured that we are taking this issue seriously, and I know there's opportunities in committees to sort of delve deeper than perhaps we can here into just actually what we're doing by district to support victims in this space. And clearly, my appeal is if people know, like many things we've mentioned today, who's committing crime, is to use 101 or your neighbourhood officer or Crime Stoppers to tell us who's responsible, and we'll use our best endeavours to bring them to book. Okay, thanks for that. Just to follow up a little bit on it, in relation to the task force on relations, has engagement with the various sectors, including the disability sector, already commenced on that?
Simon, we can't hear you.
Right, engagement has commenced. There's nearly 2 months, obviously, since I announced it at a previous board, and we've got Mark McEwen leading that work with Superintendent McColmond. So the original plan was to look at this as an operation across the country. Recent events at the Multicultural Centre and the fire there meant we've changed our approach, and using that as a pathfinder to get people from across the community around the table to develop what they want to see from us in the 12 months ahead. That work is working quickly. We've commissioned a third-party group of experts to help us with that, and clearly at committee or the next board we can update and then explain how we're going to sort of learn the lessons in the short term from that exercise around the issues at the Multicultural Centre, where you've seen recently we've made arrests, and then expand that across the country. The detail of whether we've actually spoken to anyone from disabled networks, I'll have to check and get back to you, John, because I'm not sure of that today. But it is obviously an issue of concern when you see the figures in the report that we've had a rise of 21 crimes in a short period compared to the same period last year.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Michael Atkinson, next question, Michael.
Hey, Chief Constable, hope you can hear me. Good afternoon, and just add my own congratulations to Barbara for the tremendous achievement. I think it's helpful that you've given us some additional clarity on the approach to funerals, and I suppose as an independent member, I'm very glad to hear that, and I suppose it's just to urge consistency of approach and the best that you can do to follow up promptly on some of these matters which cause so much emotion with the general public. I think the question particularly I wanted to focus on is around the outworkings of the local policing review in 2018 and the action plan that emerged from that, which is really a central measure of outcome 3, one of the main pillars of the policing plan. Now, we have been getting updates certainly from Alan, and we understand that the delivery of the plan has been under pressure from COVID anyway, but I suppose now with a flatline budget and the heavy reliance within the plan on the neighbourhood policing team levels, and you have made some reference to that in your own report. I just wondered if you could give us some assurance there of a remaining focus in that very important area at the local level, and perhaps maybe advise us of any mitigation type steps you're taking or efficiencies you're looking at in other areas to be able to maintain that strong focus on the plan and the neighbourhood teams.
Thanks, Michael. Well, certainly, obviously, the route from the consultation, which then triggered our response, has been part of the motivation for increasing the number of neighbourhood officers right across the country. And I think it's fair to say that that has been a resounding success in terms of both political and public support, because people seem to have, it was writ clear in the consultation, wasn't it, an insatiable desire for visible, accessible and responsive policing. We are trying to deliver that. I am sort of determined that we are not going to step back from the commitment we've made to grow and keep those teams, because the benefits, I think, outweigh the temptation to push any change in the workforce elsewhere. And that's not to say other parts of policing aren't important and we don't value what people do. But if we've faced the reality that we've got less, we're going to have to make changes. Either it's a bit of a grey term, isn't it, about back and middle office roles, to see that where officers aren't doing frontline policing jobs, can we change that role and put them back out into investigative teams or on the streets? How we use police staff differently, that's been something we've been talking to the trade union about. But this is something that is really close to my heart in terms of valuing neighbourhood policing and wanting to be seen not as somebody that just does it, but does it really well. Are we clear about the hallmarks? Are we clear about what good looks like? Where do we bring in good practice to keep evolving? Notwithstanding the issue is, clearly on headcount and numbers at the moment, but it's making sure we give them the best advice. So an example is we're working with our college to develop a neighbourhood faculty, where we want to see how we make the offer to every neighbourhood officer about ongoing professional development, about what works, how to do good problem solving, how to do community engagement and so on. But Alan chairs still the Neighbourhood Policing Board. So I know he is exercised about making sure the recommendations are either addressed and implemented, or where we can't proceed because of either legislation or some of the issues we're facing, we're clear about that and the updates he gives to committee.
Yeah, I mean, it is reassuring to hear those comments, and I suppose just to reinforce it from my perspective as an independent member, that there are positive signs coming back from all those efforts, even through the effectiveness reports, the PCSP. So it's just to urge you as best possible within your other priorities to keep that focus in that area if at all possible.
Certainly, I'm happy to keep the faith. I do go out a lot with not just the neighbourhood policing teams, but teams right across Northern Ireland doing different things. And I've been really impressed by people's commitment and their determination to build good relations. There's been some really impressive, not just commitment, but results from communities right across Northern Ireland. And even in the recent security event in Wattle Bridge, there was oodles of public support for the officers that were on cordons there, trying to keep people safe in that circumstance, but actually just wanting to see more visible policing, which is why we're determined to keep that going and invest in different things. Bikes seem to be a resounding success, frankly, that there seem to be a bit of a conversation changer when you're out on patrol. So I know you've got a commitment from myself and Alan to keep pushing this along, notwithstanding the stark environment we're working in at the moment in terms of potentially less officers.
Thank you. The two questions I have remaining at the moment are Tom Buchanan, and Dolores has a further question. Is there anyone else? I don't wish, it's a long day, I know, but no. Okay, Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. And again, can I just join with the congratulations to Barbara on her new role and wish her every good wish for the future. Chief, I know you've had a long day with us today, so just to bring your attention to the incident in Fermanagh, the alleged claim by the Continuity IRA of a gun attack on a police helicopter in Fermanagh a few weeks ago. Certainly it has not only raised concern, a lot of concern in the area, but it has underlined the persistent threat of terrorism right across Northern Ireland. Can you provide us then with an update into this attack, and what concern does this have for you and your officers of a potential increase in terrorism activity in the border areas right across Northern Ireland?
Thanks, Tom. Firstly, I touched on it, but actually you might have seen it firsthand, but to pay tribute to the officers that helped staff cordons, and also to colleagues from Garda Síochána in the response to this, as well as specialists that we work with to deal with what turned out to be a hoax, and also the claims that there was shots fired at the police helicopter. So obviously there's an investigation commenced. There's been commentary upon that about there was no damage to our helicopter because it wasn't flying there at the time. We have established there was a commercial aircraft nearby at the time that people claim they fired shots. That wasn't damaged either, but it probably just undermines how reckless people are if that's true. There is an investigation that Barbara's team are leading on now. I think we have to be careful we don't sort of accelerate tensions in the border area. We're working closely, as you've seen in recent days as well, in relation to an arrest and search with colleagues in the Garda Síochána again. But let me reassure you, only yesterday, Bar and I were talking with other security partners about the situation, and we're deploying as much resources as we sensibly can in the current environment to make sure that we keep people who are determined to wreck lives on a back foot. But do you want to say anything else, Barbara, on the investigation?
Yeah, I think, Chief, you've probably covered it pretty well, just around the effort and the resolve that we have within that space. I mean, what we know is that any form of terrorist organisation will take opportunities if they feel that they can. We've had significant pressure through our investigative efforts against the distant groupings, the new IRA and the Continuity IRA, and those will absolutely continue. This particular one is an ongoing investigation, as I know members are aware, and we'll continue our efforts around that.
Okay, thank you very much. Final question.
Okay, Chair, just another.
Sorry, Tom. Yeah, go
on. And thank you indeed for that, Chief Cohen. But just to touch on the issue that Trevor had mentioned earlier about the reduction in police officers, can you give us some indication as to what areas of policing will be affected as a result of the potential loss of 300 more police officers within your ranks?
It's too early to say specific functions yet, Tom. We touched upon before Pamela starting in a few weeks. This is clearly going to be one of the first issues in her in-tray to support Mark, who's on the call, has been doing sterling work with his team to try and look at what options it presents us. But to be quite candid, if we're putting a commitment to preserve neighbourhood policing, it means potentially any other role or service is in scope for reduction. What we've got to make sure is that how do we keep people out on the streets to answer 999 calls? You've seen some of the commentaries today about visible policing in some areas where there's community tension, but it will affect all of the services that we can potentially do. And inevitably, if we can't resolve this, we won't be able to close the gap just by using technology. We can improve service by doing that, but there will be a difference. And as we finalise the plans and our best assumptions in the next few weeks, we will bring a resource plan to a future board meeting where you'll be able to see the detail of the changes and our best assessment of how services will alter across the country because of the loss of officers.
Will there be any? Will this have any impact on your crime investigation and intelligence support?
Well, inevitably, to be quite candid, and I'm conscious I don't want to be accused of shroud waving, but if you've got less people doing things, something has to be different. We will have to make measured and careful choices about where we continue to invest the £758 million we have got, but I can't rule out at the moment there won't be less people gathering intelligence or investigating crime, because ultimately we've got some tough choices to make about what we do less of, and we'll keep the board briefed of that over the next few weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, Dolores, final question, please.
Thanks, Chair. My questions were around some outstanding reports, and one was the Durham report in relation to lessons learned. I mean, that has cost, you were talking about budget, but that's been costing over £1 million of public money. And then in relation to the unauthorised validation of stop and search, I mean, I wonder, have any officers been sanctioned? I presume not all disciplinary actions have to rely upon ombudsman reports. And the other bit that's outstanding is the review into policing in South Armagh. I just wonder when the board might get sight of that report. And Chief Constable, I am aware that for I don't know many years now, there have been numerous reviews of close protection policing in terms of CPU officers, which is a substantial number of officers tied up, and I think an annual cost of £10 million per annum, and yet seems to be something of a hot potato to get any result from the review. So I just wonder, could you give us some indicative timeframes as to when these reports might be coming before the board?
In terms of close protection, clearly that's a reflection largely of the severe security threat that we are dealing with here and continue to do so, Dolores. I know there's actually work being done by ACC John Roberts at the moment as part of normal practice with NICOP to review who is offered different forms of protection and why. There was a slowing down of that, partly because of COVID and availability of some of the people that help make the decisions about who does or doesn't get either full or partial protection because of the environment we work in or the role they do, and also because of some legal procedures in the margins. But I know at the moment, John is going through that process, but it is clearly an area that consumes a large amount of resource, notwithstanding that a lot of it is funded from a separate funding stream. In relation to the South Armagh review, we want to sort of bring that to the committee and then the board in the spring. There is some final work we're doing in relation to that at the moment. The validation of stop search, I think it's touched upon in one of the committee reports in relation to this was just a genuine oversight by one person that was signing off the Justice and Security Act permissions. My understanding, frankly, is they even queried it at the time and was given contrary advice. We have put that right. Therefore, I don't want to gainsay where any of this goes because there is now some legal proceedings as well as a review, but it wouldn't presume that individual officers have actually done anything wrong in conduct terms because they were just following the direction they thought they were given. So effectively, that was an admin error. And then finally, to do the YERTA update, which I think is different codes for different reports. We're aiming to get that back to the board in March.
Chairperson, I'd have to say the Surveillance Commissioner was very clear in terms of the advice that's within the authorisation for stop and search, and one has to wonder why a mistake was made or contrary advice was given. It's there in black and white, so I'm not quite convinced of accepting that rationale for no penalty. But the fact is, the Durham report did, the YERTA operation did do harm to police conduct, and I don't think we want any further delay because the policing board itself has to make its own decisions in terms of any further investigation into the steps leading up to and decisions made by senior police officers at the time.
Okay, thank you for that, and we will be getting further information, Simon, as soon as you have it. Thank you to everyone for bearing with us through a lengthy meeting. I've had messages through from a number of members who've apparently gone because of low batteries. I don't know whether it was that they themselves were running out of steam, but I suspect it was that their communications device was no longer charged. As well as the public session, we've been sat in private session since early on this morning, so a long session. And thank you very much to the Chief and all of his team for answering our questions. We're due to meet again in public forum on the 4th of March. which is exactly a year since our first coronavirus contingency planning discussion. It seems incredible and perhaps depressing to think that it's a year we've been going through this and still don't know what the final outcomes on all of it will be. But in the meantime, thank you to the police and to Simon for all the hard work that you're doing, and we will meet again soon. Thank you for everyone for your forbearance, and goodbye.